I would say my introduction to the faith was through Catholic school, and that is how I experienced the beauty of the Mass, and then I had a mystical experience at adoration that brought me into the church at age 12. So it's been the truth of the sacraments that's really brought me in. And by the way, I went to an African-American Catholic school in the South. So all of my peers, my friends, the other students with me were African American as well. And my experience coming into the church, a black priest received me into the church, and I went to a parish that was predominantly African American in Charleston, South Carolina. So my experience of the Catholic Church, my experience of the faith as a young child was one of African American people. So it wasn't until I left Charleston that I really started to see that it was much broader than just the African American community. I mean, I knew there were people who were not African American in the church, but that was not my entree into the church. It was very much through the arms of the African American Catholic community via Catholic education that brought me into the church. You know, because I had some people in my family, cousins who were Catholic and African American, it made the faith seem pretty normative to me, like it was just one of many faiths that African Americans would be in. So I felt very much at home in the church. However, it was when I started to read more about history and the history of African Americans in the church that I began to see how much they're persevering in the faith despite the kinds of, let's say, not so positive experience they had, that it even made it clear for me that the faith must be true. The faith must be the true faith for people to have persevered in it and remained with the church. So, yes, I've had many experiences actually. I generally don't talk about the specifics of them, but to suffice it to say, I had particular experiences in my Catholic high school that was integrated that was quite disappointing, mainly because I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't recognize that I was in a place that might not have been safe, and I thought that my Catholic high school should have been one of those places, but I realized it wasn't. And then I wasn't sure about how to go to the administration in the school to talk about it. So it was a painful time, really. I mean, and there are other experiences, of course, as well, but I think that was the first one where I didn't expect it, and that's what made it doubly painful. Let me just start by saying that racism is a sin, and people go to hell for it. They can go to hell for it. That's primarily why the Catholic Church is involved with issues of racism. It's not a political issue, it is a matter of people's souls. And the reason it is a pro-life issue is because at the heart of racism is a denial of the dignity of the human person. And pro-life matters deal with the dignity of the human person. I mean, that's the crux of the issue. It's the same gospel imperative to defend life in the womb as it is to defend the dignity of the human person who is Black, okay? And this country has a long history of basically embracing the demon of racism, and it has its effects. You can't have centuries of evil embraced and naively think that it doesn't have consequences, that it wouldn't have a ripple effect. And the other thing that I think that people miss in the discussion on racism is the harm that has come to white people as well. For some reason, people always and everywhere only think of the person that's oppressed, but never think of the harm that comes to the people who have been seduced by that kind of ideology, twisted by that kind of social conditioning. It's so much so that we forget the harm that happens to the entire human family. God made us all of royal status because we're made in his image and likeness. Racism says no, God is a liar. Only some people are worthy of a royal status, and that's simply not true. That's a lie from the pit of hell, and that is why we as Catholics should be involved in the racial justice movement and recognize it is very much at its heart a movement of a pro-life cause because it deals with the dignity of the human person. I'm happy because it brings to the forefront the national discussion that we should be having. And I'm hoping it encourages more and more Catholics to raise their voices. Number one, because we care about the dignity of the human person. And much like abortion, that is the legal killing of a life in the womb, when you have these extrajudicial killings by police officers, it's an abuse of the state power. It's an abuse of policing. And so we as Catholics should raise our voices to say, no, proper policing preserves life and brings people to the justice system where they can be fairly tried, examined, all those things. This short circuits the justice system, which we want to operate appropriately. And so Catholics have a voice here, and we should be raising our voice to say, no, there's a way that we want policing, and we also want to preserve human life. And because every person that's served by the police should be served respectfully and with care to preserve their life. It's a sad statement when we as Catholics don't recognize that, and we are not consistent with our care for life inside the womb, outside the womb, and at the end of life as well. So it's a consistent life ethic for us as Catholics. Every single person, no matter their background, is worthy of dignity and respect, and we should be cherishing their life and protecting it. Simple to me. People of color have been very hard hit economically and health-wise by this pandemic. You have African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, for example, being hard hit. And what does it say about our country? Well, I think that this actually is an opportunity now for us to be in radical solidarity with people who are suffering, and people who were suffering before the coronavirus pandemic, people who were suffering economically. We now get a taste maybe of that kind of anxiety of how is it that I'm going to pay my bills? You know, some of us may be sharing that same anxiety that people have all along. This is a time for us to come together as a country, as a community, and say, we want to do better. We have to do better about taking care of those people who are on the margins, and now maybe a large number of us are on the margins, and so we are considering these issues. Also, in terms of healthcare, we should be having discussions about what healthcare looks like, what should be the minimum healthcare we should want for every person in this country, because we're realizing there are a lot of gaps. There are a lot of people who cannot get proper healthcare. And in a pandemic, that's the worst place that we want to be. Thankfully, though, we could at least do the small things of hoping not spreading it by wearing masks, washing our hands, social distancing, these small little things that we can do as a community to try to stem the spread and care for our neighbor. And as Catholics, I would think that we'd want to take on these minor sacrifices for the greater good of our neighbor and loving our neighbor. So Cardinal Gregory has pointed out that while we're dealing with the COVID virus, we also need to deal with the virus of racism. And what is it that the Catholic Church should be doing and individual Catholics should be doing? Well, I think, first of all, the Catholic Church needs to remind people that racism, again, is a sin. And it is a sin that imperils your eternity with God. It imperils your soul. And this is why we as Catholics are concerned about racism, because it is a matter of sin. Okay, sometimes I think people think it's merely a political issue, and we need to recognize this is about salvation. So number one, we need to do that, address it as actually a sin. Number two, I think the church also should have a reckoning with any place in the church where we, instead of mirroring the gospel, we mirrored the prevailing attitudes at the time. Instead of being a place where people could come in and see what we really believe about the human person, and it was a place free of racism, it wasn't that in all cases. And so we should talk about that history and try to make amends for it. I think one of the beautiful things about Catholicism is that in our spirituality, we often make reparations for sins. And when people say, I didn't own slaves, I didn't this, I didn't that, and I was like, you're a Catholic and you're saying this? My goodness, Jesus Christ never committed a sin, but he took up the cross for us. Who are we as Catholics to not want to take up a cross or make reparations for these sins? And we also need to remember that sin is chiefly an offense against God. And what Catholic, because we love God, would not want to make reparations for that? So these are the things that we could do as a church: admit that it's a sin, talk about our history. As Catholics, we can make spiritual acts of reparation. And we can also read our bishop's statements about racism, pray on it, ask the Lord to reveal those places in our lives where we may not be aware that we are affected by racism. And I would say those are the main things, for starters, that the church can do and that Catholics should try to do. Well, I kept the faith because, like I said, when I came into the church as a child at age 12, I had a mystical experience during adoration where I came to know that he was alive and real, present, really present during adoration. And I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten that fundamental truth about what we believe. And so it's sort of been like a glue. I've sort of like a barnacle on the side of the ship of the church. There's no getting me loose, okay? And I also don't judge the church by the actions of others. I mean, I am a sinner too. And while I can marvel at other people committing sin, I myself think about, well, I did too. I do too. And so I recognize that we're human. And it is through God's mercy that we can always begin again. We can always convert. We can always try again. And so that has been my hope as well, is that as we deal with the demon of racism and try to exorcise it out of the church and out of this country, we realize every time we fall into that particular sin, we can go to confession and get up again and try to do better. I mean, this is our walk, right? Is to get holy or die trying. And so I don't let sinfulness of others make me forget the truthfulness of the church, who she's built upon, who is really present in the sacraments. And that will, no one else's bad behavior is going to separate me from he who I say I love. I could never walk away from the Eucharistic table. I could never walk away from the sacrament of reconciliation because of other people's bad behavior, even if that bad behavior involves people who are of the clergy. You know, I am not going to abandon Jesus because others do. I just couldn't. And so I take that approach in terms of the faith. That's what keeps me here. I know who is really present, and I know that humanity is fallen and that we're weak, and that's why we have the sacrament of reconciliation always to come back to him. And so that kind of hope is what also makes me have faith in our society, because as we, as the church, purify ourselves and continue conversion and pray to God to ask for his graces upon our country, I believe that we change our country as well. It's a spiritual work and it's going to take time, but we have to persevere in the faith. And I also know that Jesus Christ has already won the victory. The job for us now is just to continue in the battle and to spread the seeds of the gospel. We may not be blessed to see the increase, but we know that the Holy Spirit will make those seeds grow as long as people cooperate. But my job is not to naysay it because I'm not seeing cooperation now. My job is to continue and persevering in the faith and loving Jesus Christ. And that's what I'm going to do because I owe allegiance to him who I love. So what was my reaction to Pope Francis elevating Wilton Gregory to a cardinal, the first African-American cardinal in the United States? And what does it mean to me and other Black Catholics? We're celebrating, we're happy. We finally get to see our native son, if you will, become a prince of the church. I mean, considering the history of the church in the United States regarding Black people in general and Black men in particular, and not seeing them as being worthy or capable of the priesthood, I mean, that's painful. And we know it's not true, right? God calls whomever he calls among those men who are willing to follow him in this particular way. And Cardinal Gregory said yes. And like me, he also is a product of Catholic schools, that being exposed to the faith and early on hearing a call to the priesthood and being willing to pursue it. And I'm sure he did it in times that were not easy and not necessarily welcoming. And so for him now to be a prince of the church, it's a moment of celebration in the community, because we finally feel like the church recognizes that we as Black people have gifts to give her. And we gave the church one of our sons, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, and we would give more of ourselves as well if the church will receive it. So I would say for me, that is what I take away. And I know that that same kind of joy and that this gift of Blackness being brought to the church is being fully received now in the Church of the United States, which for a long time had some resistance to that gift. And so we're happy about that. And let's see what else will come of this generous gift of our community to our own church and what more will come from this. So just happy.